Welcome to the Enterprise GTM podcast, hosted by Tim Zonka and Vidya Raman. Each episode takes a deep dive into how to successfully maneuver the unique dynamics of enterprise go-to-market while candidly discussing successful approaches, pitfalls, and failures alike. Our guests are seasoned company founders, GTM execs, technology buyers, and end users. Please note that the views expressed by individuals in these podcasts are not to be treated as investment advice. They are also not representing the views of their employers, current or previous.
Well, welcome. Today, Vidya and I are excited to have on the podcast Barry Dauber. So Barry is the Vice President of GenAI go-to-market at Databricks. He came to Databricks a year ago from the MosaicML acquisition. And at Mosaic, he was the VP of Sales and BD. And prior to that, Barry had sales, BD, strategic alliances roles at Primary AI, Cloudera, among others. He's been part of some amazing startup journeys, including the most recent one at MosaicML, where they grew revenue from 0 to 20 million in under 7 months, and the company was bought for a whopping $1.3 billion, a little over 2 years since their inception, which is just simply astounding. Barry, welcome. It's awesome to get a chance to talk with you.
Yeah, Tim, Vidya, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So let's start a little bit about with your experience, especially at MosaicML. Could you tell us briefly, what was that core offering about and how did it get received by the market?
Yeah, definitely. So the core offering in our hypothesis at the time, and you have to remember this was before ChatGPT came out. So the world has changed drastically since October, November 2022. And our founders came from the semiconductor space where they were initial people to basically build a hardware accelerator for the machine learning AI space. So obviously GPUs have taken off, but as we remember, GPUs weren't initially created for AI ML workloads. They were created for graphical processing, hence their name. And our founders did this at the chip level, sold to company Nirvana Systems, sold that to Intel for a boatload of money, ran the Intel AI group for a number of years, and then parachuted out. Did a few things in between, and then ultimately started Mosaic. And the reason for going through that background is it was always around basically being efficient or driving efficiency, whether, Nirvana was at the chip level. At Mosaic, they took it up one level up the stack to the software level, which arguably is a lot easier to produce and much cheaper to create. And, you hire a bunch of really smart people, do a bunch of math, do a bunch of research, and hopefully you get some code that goes and does some amazing things. So we were known as the efficient ML company to basically train large scale models. Now we would call it like a GPT model or any sort of one of those LLMs at scale as cheaply as possible. So we had an open source product or capability called Mosaic Composer that was a replacement for some open source components, part of PyTorch, that would allow us to basically train a model quicker than you could do otherwise. So instead of spending hours on a GPU, you're spending tens of minutes. So instead of doing it over like half a day, you're doing your training over lunch. So dropping that cost made this approachable to our potential customers. And also dropping the cost made it approachable from a capability perspective. It's like, what can we now do from a use case perspective that we couldn't have necessarily done before because these costs were unattainable?
Yeah. Did you find that, I just can't imagine 0 to like a $1.3 billion valuation in the course of 2 years. How consistent did that value proposition or that position stay over those 2 years, or did it change, especially to any significant degree?
No, the value prop and what we sold it evolved for sure. But what I would say is really important is starting out and being laser focused. I've been at a number of startups and, we all try to do everything to all the customers that we go out to serve. And one of the big things that our founding team and leadership that we were dead set on was we were going to be the best vendor out there for pre-training large models at scale. And at the time, everybody asked me, they're like, hey, that's awesome. You guys can train these models. What about fine tuning? You're like, nope, that's going to come in the future. They're like, well, you have these models. What about serving the models? What are we going to do with that? And you're like, nope, we don't want the distraction. We'll do that in the future. So we were hyper focused on building an amazing platform for training, again, large models. And we didn't care if it was text or video or audio or, other multimodalities. But it was these large models at scale that could do very specific things. So the other unique thing we were able to do with that is, from a sales perspective, I could create who my ICP was really, really quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually made it really hard to get through our contact us form, subsequently after, months after starting our, really go to market journey, because I didn't want a bunch of random people reaching out. Like, it was a very specific person that wanted to train at scale. And those training runs were tens to hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars.
I want to dig into that a little bit too. I mean, a bit on an ICP, but to take a step back, when you think about a startup, and for example, I was CEO at a small startup where I was brought in to help one of the founders who was very technically savvy and kind of the main architect and the brains behind the product. And then jointly we took it to market, and I kind of saw myself as like the main sales guy. We didn't want to scale beyond that until we just had mastered the sale, like the first 10 sale, reasonably sized sales. And because we wanted to understand the ICP. So what about in your experience? I assume you've, I don't know if it was Mosaic or maybe, some of the other organizations, when you've been brought in where that's already happened, what's it like going into that organization, and what did they have right? And what did you actually have to refigure out because it wasn't quite right?
Yeah, definitely. So that's always an interesting question. And one, I bring that up on job interviews when I'm going on to my next startup. So obviously not for a long time now. And it's something I asked Naveen when we were coming over when I was interviewing to go to Mosaic. And I will say directly, like, it doesn't matter who you hire as a startup. The CEO, C-suite founders, they're going to be the best salespeople for a long time at the company, right? Because people take them seriously immediately. Your customers do. They know they're going to be the ones that have to lean in and ultimately make the tough decisions if we're going to build this product or this capability or that integration or go deploy on-prem or in a VPC or, whatever those tough questions are. And they know the CEO is going to be the person that's going to be able to lean in to make that happen. With that being said, CEOs are all over the place in terms of their knowledge. And I was lucky in that, Naveen had done it before and is super knowledgeable about what he's doing, but also understands, and it comes down to, and this isn't specific to Mosaic, but strong leadership in general. And A+ players or A players like to hire A+ players, right? And you hire people that are specialists in marketing, in sales, in product, in engineering, if you don't have those unique capabilities yourself. So it's interesting for us. And I will say, from a sales perspective, I am very much a startup early sales person. Like, I love figuring out the product market fit, sitting with engineering, sitting with products, sitting with customers, figuring out what their actual technical needs are, and then funneling that back to engineering, to product, to the company leadership. So it's not, I was the first salesperson, I'm responsible for the sale, but there's so much months of work that goes into getting you to that first sale and figuring out pricing, figuring out packaging, figuring out how you market this to those people, who is the ICP, all those sorts of things. So it's definitely hard at startup world, right? And if you hire a salesperson that's used to inbound leads and lead flow, and they know who the ICP is, they know what the messaging is, because you need to rinse and repeat.
Yeah.
Really, really fast.
How do you think about, especially going in when you've been kind of like as like a first seller scenario, how do you think about scaling sales, in particular, like the timing? So it doesn't sound like a leading question. One of the things I've seen is, and I've seen them kind of both succeed and fail, is there are sales leaders that are like, look, I need to get to the point where I'm stretched so thin and the demand is so high, like, and then I bring in people. And others are like, no, we know that it's going to be there. Let's just go build out the capacity and then they'll go capture the. What's your approach to that? And how do you think about timing?
Or if I may add one more thing to the second scenario, it's actually not working so well. So we actually need some sales specialists to come help out. So I guess, one is scenario where it's working, the demand is clear, and we just need more people to scale things out. And the other, it ain't working. So we need some specialists to come help out.
Yeah, those are two very tough questions, or, one question with multiple parts that And I was early in my career in management consulting. So terrible answer is it depends, but it really does depend on the market and what you're selling. And again, I've been in a lot of startups where we were overwhelmed with the need and you just have to hire people because you start to do the math pretty quickly. And you also need to have a board that's understanding of potential reality and what your revenue is going to be. Because it's easy for anybody who's like, okay, if our revenue has to be $20 million this year, or $50 million, and we think on average a seller can sell 2, 3, 4, 5 million, whatever it is, 1 million. That doesn't take rocket science math skills to figure out that, okay, we're going to need 5 to 12 people, depending on what our average sale price and what our quota is of our salespeople to be able to get there. With that being said, I've always taken the approach of I want to be stretched really thin. And when I came to Mosaic, I use the phrase of like, I want to be beyond drowning. We're not missing deals, but let's make sure that we don't bring people on before we actually have capacity to feed them, right? Because I always think about a famous line. I think it was Larry Ellison, at least I always attribute it to Larry Ellison, who said this probably decades ago about salespeople. There's 2 types of salespeople in the world, new ones and rich ones. And I always like to expand the rich of, rich could be obviously monetarily, it could be intelligently fulfilled, it could be the relationships they have at the organization, right? It doesn't necessarily just have to be financially. Like they feel that what they're doing is beneficial to society, to themselves, all sorts of people. So when you start to think about that line, and again, I think about it all the time, especially when hiring, is salespeople that are looking for jobs are either not performing in their current role or probably bored. So if they're bored, that's fine. Or even if they're not performing well in their current role, that's potentially fine, right? Maybe they went to a company that wasn't a good fit, or, product wasn't there, or, the sales infrastructure wasn't there, marketing wasn't there. There's a whole host of reasons. But when you think about that and you start to think about the people you're going to be able to hire, you're taking them away from either crushing their numbers and making tons of money to a place that's a little opaque. And it's like, look, I'm going to help you make as much money as you possibly can, but I don't know if you're going to make as much as you currently do.
Yeah.
For me, it's not a transactional relationship with the people that I work with. It's much more of a long-term relationship. And I want to do right by my colleagues, my future colleagues, and them as individuals and them as their families, or inclusive of their families. And bringing somebody over and not being able to help them be able to be successful, I never felt was really fair.
Yeah.
So that's why I've always taken the approach of let's make sure that I am drowning, but again, at the same time, like you don't want to be, there's an opportunity cost, right? You can't be missing out on a
great
deal.
Nuance too, that the way I think until I heard you articulate it like that, just the kind of the value as you bring, especially experienced good sellers onto a team, where in many cases, they're just crushing it. And so they're subscribing to something different, right? They're subscribing like, they have this like, I need to do it to further my fulfillment or my career or whatever it is, even if that means in the short term, I'm taking this risk where I might not be making what I am now.
Right. And as long as you're upfront with them on the potential risk that they're taking, and I take an interesting approach when I interview these people of, hey, I know it's an interview, but the challenge with interviewing salespeople is they're going to say exactly what they think you want to hear, right? If they're good salespeople, hopefully they're going to be really good at selling themselves. So I actually flip it on its head and try to convince the person why they're not going to be successful at the organization I'm at. Like, oh, by the way, like we don't have marketing, we don't have sales, we don't have product market fit yet. Like whatever the reasons are, and obviously not speaking to any one organization I've worked for specifically, but you start to go through like, what do you not have? We don't have SDRs. Like you will go find your own leads. Yeah, we have some coming in through the website, but like, is that scary for you? Here's a proverbial blank sheet of paper. Is that like, holy moly, that's awesome? Or are you a little concerned?
Yeah,
and you can start to suss that out pretty quickly because there's a difference as we all know between startup salespeople. And, I was alluding to this earlier about myself and big company salespeople. And both are great, but different stages of your company require very different things. And early on, you really need very hungry, curious people. They're going to roll with the punches and figure out how to go get up from being knocked down. And typical sales has to do this too. But also just think about messaging, right? Messaging at a startup, like that changes like that.
Right. Yeah, I always used to, it kind of startups I worked at, I loved it when we would get someone late in the hiring cycle and they'd be like, hey, we want you to talk to this person now. And I was like, do you want me to sell them or scare them? Because where are they at? Where's their brain at? Well,
The
you mentioned
scaring is important, right?
It is, yeah. They got to know what you want
exactly.
them
As we learn
to know
in
what
sales, especially in startup world, no is almost as exciting as yes, right? Because my time is finite. I can go move on to somebody who's actually going to buy from us. And that's what was exciting at Mosaic early on, is we knew exactly, like I was saying, who our dream customer was. So it's funny, when we came over to Databricks, they looked at our Mosaic website and they're like, you guys have the most convoluted contact us form I've ever seen. I was like, oh, that was by design. We had too many inbounds and they were all not people I wanted to talk to and just wasted my time. I was like, I wanted to make it really, really, really hard to get through, where you had to answer a bunch of very specific questions. And look, we still had people come through. It's not like everybody that came through we chose to deal to. But it made it, our time on the phone, because it was mainly just me, much more successful.
Yeah. And so what about when you started to bring on board, marketing, like more marketing capacity? And what did that look like as it sounds like you were helping make some of these decisions around finding the right ICP, and especially if it's like pre-product market fit? Any areas of things of either success or, hey, watch out, I wouldn't do it this way again, as it related to bringing on marketing, especially to help spin up additional demand?
Yeah, so we had marketing. This was actually one of the first startups I joined where marketing already existed. And our marketing team was, it was small, but it was doing a great job. But since we had an open source capability, marketing in kind of the early startup world is all around community building and becoming thought leaders in that space. And as silly as it is to say out loud, but I think everybody here knows this, and the listeners listening in, is it comes down to like GitHub stars.
Yeah.
How can we maximize, our GitHub stars on our open source repository? And we spent a ton of time doing that. And I had great partners in marketing and great partners on engineering and research that, again, since we were so hyper-focused, we knew that we had to lead with deep technical blogs and capabilities and tweets. So actually, the vast majority of our marketing was events that we'd go to, and the people on the team much smarter than me would speak at, and then blog posts and tweets. So marketing for us was not actually crazy big cost center. A lot of it, blogs, obviously there's an opportunity cost because they're writing a blog versus doing research or engineering. But for the most part, paid off in spades.
Okay. I want to run one more question past you. I've been kind of hogging the question airwaves, though, and then I'll turn it over to Vidya. She's got some that she wants to run past you. But your experience includes business development, strategic partnerships, and things like that. How do you think about scaling a business where you're adding kind of motions with partners? Because it could be so alluring, but it could also, you could take like one partner can consume the capacity of like a whole company if you do it the wrong way. So how do you think about adding that into the mix?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Something that I'm always both excited to go pursue at early stage companies and a little weary of as well. And I've reminded my teams at every company I've ever been at, and remind myself on a daily basis, especially as somebody that was formerly in the kind of consulting world, is consultants get paid to have meetings. We do not, which is really something to think about, because when they're talking to their customers, they're getting paid for that. When we're talking to customers, we're trying to convince them to go buy a physical good or, software good or something. And consultants obviously build physical things now as well. The other challenge with working with partners initially is when you're really small, there's an opportunity cost to them, right? Yeah. It's, Mosaic, it was hard for us to go get in front of the big system integrators. Once we're at Databricks, we have very strong relationships with the big system integrators because they have practices built around us. Mm-hmm. So I spent a decent amount of time, but I was also opportunistic to a degree and would rely on relationships I already had. And, opportunistic. So if people reached out, we would definitely work with them. And relationships, people that I trusted and would be direct with me, was always helpful. The other thing I remind people of all the time on partnerships is the easiest way to drive a partnership, especially as the small company, is you need to bring a customer. And partnerships require, I love speaking cliches, a three-legged stool, right? We need us, the partner, and the customer. Yeah. And if one of us is missing, we're probably not going to be successful. That stool's going to fall over.
Did you find that you had either a bias or more success doing partnerships where, out of the gate, you're like, look, it's all got to be about revenue, or maybe in another case, like, no, it's actually got to be, we just need more reach and awareness and we know how to go bring the revenue in. Like, did you tend to have a bias toward one or the other?
Revenue is always crazy important. And I think ultimately every partnership you engage in should be something that leads to revenue, but it doesn't have to necessarily be direct. Like again, at Mosaic was interesting is, we were really good at training a model from scratch. Like I said earlier, we didn't do the model serving. So we would need partners that would do the model serving for us. Oh, and by the way, like getting data ready to then go train a model is also very important. Big reason Databricks bought us, right? We slotted in super well, but I always talked about kind of upstream and downstream partners. So we had downstream partners that were doing the model observability and explainability capabilities that we weren't going to build, at least initially at Mosaic, but absolutely required because our internal customer, right? My research team at Mosaic, our research team had to go see like, how are these models performing relative to, other versions? We didn't have that capability. And there's open source platforms, but as we know, some are better than others. And so we would have partners that we'd work with, or customers would already have capabilities they'd want. So we'd have to have integration. So there's probably more important is the long-winded answer to this. I think it's almost more important to have ISV or software partnerships where you're building those integrations to UIs and systems and capabilities that they already have. Yeah. Right? Because the biggest risk to a startup is, and this is every company, there's a huge change management component if you're doing something correctly. And you're already trying to get somebody to take a bet on your tiny little company to go do some capability. They need to go into some other system to go do that. That's taking them away from their day job, right? And if you can go integrate into the system they're already in, or it's just a simple API integration or API call, and they're able to go pull it into whatever dashboards or systems or workflows they have, that's going to make you infinitely sticky.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, speaking of cliches, the way that I like to think about it, at least when I was PM, I would try and think along the lines of customer journeys. In as far as a customer journey for machine learning or an AI product is concerned, there's the data prep and getting a model trained and then eventually serve it and all of that. So what does it take to make that all happen, and what products are needed in the ecosystem? It looks like you're alluding to something similar to that. Actually, a good segue from here would be a topic that I wanted to bring up, which is very classic for a startup, which is that most founders and companies who are ambitious, they want to build a platform. They don't want to have just a point solution and just do that forever. But same cannot be said to be true of customers, right? Customers want specific problems to be solved, and the more specific and straightforward it is, the easier, just like you said. So as someone who's previously been at an early stage startup, how have you dealt with this challenge where maybe as a startup you wanted to appear bigger than you actually are, sound like you're more important than you actually may be for a large enterprise customer? So in that sense, maybe you've had to sell yourself as a platform, but then the customer maybe would prefer really a point solution, like an application, if you will. How have you dealt with that?
Yeah, I think it's tough as a startup to position, like a really early stage startup, to position yourself as a platform, right? Because if I was an end customer, I would laugh at somebody. Mosaic, we never positioned ourselves as a platform. If I went into big bank or big pharma or big government or big corporate America and told them I was a platform, like, oh, that's awesome. Have you passed, SOC 2, ISO 27001? Are you HIPAA compliant? Do you have PCI? And we had some of them. But like immediately you're disqualified, right? And it's like, okay, let's not pretend to be things that I'm not. Being a point solution can be challenging too, but ultimately, like a lot of startups, are capabilities, right? And that's where I think the partnership, going back to that, does come in big time, because customers ultimately want a solution. They don't necessarily need it to be a platform, but you need to integrate into their platform. Right. And I haven't been as involved in like the Salesforces of the world, but there's a reason that Dreamforce is such a massive conference, right? Because they've built this incredible platform that has lots and lots and lots of ISVs and partners in their ecosystem that all build off of this data, and then you can build these capabilities. Similar Databricks, right? Databricks with their Data AI Summit, we have tens of thousands of people coming. A lot of them are data practitioners and AI and GenAI practitioners, but we have a good number of people that are starting to build on top of, the Databricks platform. And you really need to get to a certain size of a company where you can really start to claim to be a platform. So as a startup, I don't think you're going to be taken seriously. And maybe I'm totally wrong. I'm sure there's examples that
No, I
contradict
haven't come across a contradiction. It's just that, at least in as far as pitching to VCs goes, everybody calls themselves a platform. And I've always wondered how that flies with customers.
I think what's useful to hear about your perspective there too is, Vidya, I think you're right. It's the VCs, and it's also, I think, board conversation, which is like, hey, should we really be more of a platform? And so it's useful to hear the precision with which you're speaking about what role do we play, and let's be realistic from a customer's point of view.
Right.
I think that's really good guidance.
Exactly. And I think ultimately we strive to be platforms, right? That's what everybody's goal is. But you also need to understand where you are today. And you can talk about your platform journey of look, this is where we hope to get. And we want to own the whole GenAI or AI ecosystem end to end. But early on, you've got to be laser focused on just nailing something very, very well if you really want to scale quickly.
Absolutely. So switching to the topic of Gen AI, Barry, so you're right in the middle of the storm, if you will. But Gen AI is not definitely the first big technology wave you've seen in your career. You worked at Cloudera before this. We both were at Cloudera. You'd ridden the big data wave, if you will. And so curious to hear from you, how would you compare and contrast, besides just the sheer excitement and the appetite for Gen AI, which seems like it's through the roof, what are some of the similarities and differences you're seeing between that big data wave and the Gen AI wave in your customer base?
That's a tough question, but a really good one. I think big data was, more of a flash in the pan. And obviously, big data is still currently being utilized, but nobody says that term anymore because the data got so big. Everybody just kind of had big data. And you're like, well, this isn't impressive to talk about. And everybody had to go put in a data warehouse or a lake house or some sort of object storage. But I do think, and maybe the Gen AI term doesn't stay forever because not everything we're doing is generative AI, right? And it's good to remind people what these acronyms stand for. But I do think the capabilities around building these Gen AI or compound systems or agentic systems, the newest term we're hearing, they are such a force multiplier of lots of back office or data prep or content retrieval or content generation. They are so much better even today at solving tasks for humans. You can only imagine where they're going to be going in the future, especially, as we get better at the whispers of the world, the speech to text, which then goes and starts kind of that agentic compound system workflow that goes and pulls very specific information, right? We all think about call centers are one of the most popular, examples people always talk about because all of us interact with call centers on a daily basis, or maybe not daily, weekly basis. And imagine if you could actually go have a lot of that automated and get to the answers you want really, really quickly. The time to resolution for the company and the time to value for you as a human who gets the answer to something very quickly is huge. And these AI systems are really helping to do that. But I think a lot of it, going back to the big data comment, is built on the ability that we now have access to tons and tons and tons of data to go create these models. And if I get my stats right, so at Databricks, we trained, it was a state-of-the-art model for about 2.5 weeks until Llama 3 came out, DBRX, on 12 trillion tokens of text. And 12 trillion tokens of text is so much data, I don't even think we can get our heads around how much that is. And I always like to remind myself that a decent length book is 100,000 tokens. It's pales into comparison to how much data has to be utilized to go train these models, at least at scale, to be able to answer generalizable tasks. So as the data becomes more easily stored, and obviously we're doing a lot that and others are as well, or a lot there, as it's easier and cheaper to go utilize these models, to go fine tune these models, to go pre-train the models, as it's easier to go build out these systems, I think we're going to see a lot more of this taking over our lives in a positive way. I don't think necessarily humans are going to be impacted immediately, that hopefully are going to be losing their jobs, hopefully not losing their jobs.
Yep.
But potentially, like, can we have 100 call center operators instead of
Mhm.
200, right? We
Mhm.
don't need to go higher for growth because they can go through the much more difficult questions versus the ones that are very obvious, like that's either yes or no answer, or, the more of a binary response.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the plethora of applications that you mentioned, definitely the leaders in the enterprise and everyone else in the market is seeing that, and it's manifesting itself in perhaps more budgets being easily available for the adoption of Gen AI, perhaps. I mean, you'd know best. Do you see anything along the lines of what kinds of stakeholders are getting involved in these Gen AI innovations as you are going out there leading GTM? And I wonder again how that is any different from what it was in the big data wave. Are still the ICPs still more around the same or any different?
I think the ICPs are probably more the same. It's a lot of data engineers and ML engineers and data scientists. You're in the technology arm, and depending on where that sits within the organization you're talking to. But I think and you're talking to the business users that obviously interface with those, right? Because
For
ultimately these
sure.
technology people are the customer, typically, of the business users trying to go drive some sort of business value. But
Yep.
I think the big difference that I've seen in the Gen AI space is how much of a push there is from the top down, right? You
Hmm.
know how C-suites and boards going, oh my gosh, we need a Gen AI initiative and a story. We need to go start doing something. So everybody goes and stands up, one of the proprietary large models and starts kicking the tires.
Hmm.
And I don't think we necessarily saw that with big data because it was so much harder to get started initially, right? And I
Yep.
don't think you had boards coming to the CEO and being like, oh my God, you got to go buy Cloudera immediately, when we were
Yep.
there 10 years ago. I never saw that happen, right? Like, obviously, we had to go in and because it was much more of a rip and replace. It's like, hey, you have this antiquated on-prem data system that's, slower, more expensive, not as scalable. You're not getting the access to the analytics you expect. And there's obviously immense value there, but it was harder a decade ago to really get a C-suite excited about that, right? Whereas now it's, what are the things that we can do that I couldn't have even fathomed that we could do before? Right. And whether that's,
Yep.
back office cost savings or, front office, to use kind of finance terms, revenue generation. What new products and capabilities can we now provide that we never thought were possible
Hmm.
because of these kind of AI systems that we can produce? I think that's what's driving some of this hype, but a lot of the like top down, not necessarily mandates, but interest in, talking to organizations like mine, where people are diving in to go figure out how they can get started to go build things that hopefully transform what they're doing.
That is so true. I think just the promise of having very tangible and immediate benefits and applications come out of Gen AI is definitely one of the most exciting things that we're seeing today. And as you're looking at, again, from today's point of view, what are some of the key roadblocks that you're seeing as enterprises are, going through this journey of realizing applications and use cases leveraging AI?
There's a number. I think ultimately it comes down to quality and cost. So is the quality of that model, whether it's, a system, a compound system of models and capabilities, or you're using like an OpenAI or an Anthropic or, a Llama 3 or DBRX, is that model reaching a quality that's quote unquote good enough for what we're trying to do, right? Is it better than the
Hmm.
human that's doing it today? Or is it at least almost as good as a human, but it's a fraction the amount of time? So, go back to what I said earlier. It depends on the use cases.
Hmm.
But I think we're seeing people care immensely about the quality and the accuracy of what these systems are doing. Cost plays a huge component in that, right? It's not
Yep.
very helpful if these systems are amazing, but they cost more than a human doing it,
Yeah.
right? Like, and even if, the humans could scale and it was still cheaper to use humans, like that's not going to happen. But I think
Well,
what
you could always, I guess, say the excuse that this was a top-down initiative. That's how we
right.
justify it.
But the board would probably come after,
I'm
that
sure,
individual
eventually.
pretty quickly.
Yeah.
I think quality matters a lot. Control of the data matters a lot. And I'm seeing a lot of people with some of the large models of, look, as we talked about, this is trained on lots and lots and lots of data. There's only so much access to lots of data. You have to basically go mine the internet multiple times over. So are you picking up information that is proprietary, is copyrighted, all those sorts of things? So you've got to be careful there. And big organizations definitely want to be careful on, their data leaving, what data is coming into their systems. And then differentiation around that, right? If you're a financial services firm and you're all using the same model to go seek alpha or go execute trades or, whatever it is you're doing to go inform your decision making, how differentiated are you? So how do you instill your data from your business, your IP into these outputs? And at Databricks, we call that going from like general intelligence to data intelligence, right? How can you start to utilize the data that you have within your four walls to go educate these systems, to go educate these models, to help you be that force multiplier to go make whatever trades or figure out what the next molecule is for that life-saving drug or whatever the use case ends up being?
I love that term, general intelligence to data intelligence. That's very cool. Very cool. Before we jump to the last section of the podcast, Tim, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask Barry about? Any follow-ups on anything that we've discussed so far?
Maybe just a quick one. I'd love your quick take on, you had even mentioned notions of is training is occurring and is it picking up any kind of proprietary or private or erroneous information? Talk a little bit about the concern that people have and like kind of what you see as either current or kind of near-term ways of helping mitigate that.
Yeah, there's concerns in basically every regulated company and every company that's basically publicly traded because they're more or less regulated as well. For prototyping, tire kicking internally, right, as we're just figuring out realm of possible, using some of these capabilities people are open to. But as you start to go from POC to production, and I cite a stat all the time when I'm doing talks, 90% of people are struggling or organizations are struggling to go from POC production. And one of these reasons is because of that. And there's the fear, it's not just of inclusion of data that might not be relevant. It might be toxic. It might be inappropriate for work. But it's also, you're a financial services firm. Do you need a model that's going to be able to answer, what led to the fall of Rome or world history or aging or all of these capabilities? I think there's like 57 or 58 categories or topic areas that are included in the it's a mouthful, the multitask model language understanding benchmark of how these models are scored. But you at a massive bank, what led to the fall of Rome, super interesting, not going to help you go execute on that trade today or tomorrow. Most likely, right? Like maybe some historical events are interesting. And how can you start to basically dial that in to make sure the results you're getting back are relevant, but also you're paying for what you need, right? Why go hit a massive model when you can use a much smaller model for a much more specific task? That also helps with hallucinations and kind of you can build guardrails and things around these models to make sure that you're protecting your IP, you're protecting your employees, you're operating in kind of exclusion of like the not safe for work content that you don't want getting across. You're not leaking PII or other protected information. That's where building these systems or frankly, building and training models from scratch. And this was a big message we had at Mosaic was your data, your models. And now at Databricks, we co-opted that to be your data, your AI. But it's the only way you can really guarantee what data went into that model is training that model from scratch. And the big thing we did at Mosaic from day one was, again, lowering that cost. So this is actually something you could go after yourself.
That makes sense. Yeah, thanks.
All right, so now we get to the last part of the conversation here, Barry, which we're calling a rapid fire true or false question. So I'll say a statement. You can either agree, say true or false. Optionally, you can also provide some clarification, if you want to say a sentence or two about each point here. So are you ready for that?
I am. It's going to be hard for me just to say one true or false, and I'll try not to
You,
ask follow-ups and go into sentences. I can tend
it's
deeper,
okay. You
but
can say it depends, the consultant answer, and you can give a sentence too if that's better. Hopefully, not all depends, but
yeah,
we'll
no,
see.
I'll try to keep it short.
All right, no worries. All right, the first one is so bottoms up adoption will continue to be key for early stage startups in the data infra space moving forward.
True.
Okay, second one is standalone generative AI SaaS applications will see a lot more competition from DIY efforts. So basically, enterprises building their own stuff. You mentioned compound systems. So regardless of the approach, would standalone generative AI SaaS applications see a lot more competition from DIY compared to the previous era of SaaS applications?
I think false. And this is one I talk about 5 gazillion times a day in my current role. DIY is huge and you're going to see people doing it. But ultimately, I think it's going to come down to the Databricks of the world, the hyperscalers of the world that are really doing a lot of this. And there's going to be bits and pieces that are do it yourself. But as you saw, Databricks early on with like Apache Spark, right? Like you could go download the open source, or even with Mosaic, you could go get PyTorch, you could go use our Mosaic composer, package together all these open source components. But the immediate question I ask people is why? You can do it what's perceived as cheaper, but how many people are you going to have to go hire to go do that? You're, an enterprise or a startup. Do you have the capabilities to do this? So I'd say there's going to be bits and pieces of people doing the DIY for some specific competencies. But ultimately, as we talked about earlier, and I realize this is a way longer answer than my false
No, it's
that I
okay.
promised at the beginning, is our customers that we're selling to, especially in enterprise, want solutions, right? And they need those solutions to be governed. They care about data lineage and auditability. And it's hard to do that when you're hacking together a bunch of DIY open source frameworks. And something breaks, do you have that team on call that's ready to go fix that? That's why, companies like mine exist today.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I just realized, based on our entire conversation, that maybe because of all the reasons you mentioned, especially for Gen AI SaaS applications, the competition will probably DIY makes a lot less sense, just given the complexity, the data, and the newness of AI and the complexity that comes with that. All right. So the next few questions are basically, talking about like a today versus 5 years from now. So we are basically asking you to have that crystal ball out from
Right.
your back
Which is
pocket.
almost impossible in the Gen AI space. I remind
For
everybody
sure.
like Gen AI or, ChatGPT was what, 19 months ago now.
Yep.
And in one anecdote to that, which is interesting, when I started at Mosaic, I like reminding people, as we said earlier, ChatGPT hadn't come out yet. I was literally selling and talking to customers about neural network training software. And people look at me and be like, what the heck is neural network training software? And I was like, that's awesome. You're not a good fit for us. So going back to our ICP conversation, right?
That's
Like
wild.
And then ChatGPT came out, and I immediately was like, hey, would you want your own ChatGPT on your own data that you own? And then I knew we were really onto something. And I know this is not directly answering the question, but I do love this story. And
Yeah.
I'll just send this podcast to my mom so she listens to it. I've been in the deep tech space for a long time and love the nerdier of nerdy products and loved working with, very nerdy engineering and research teams. And I'm a huge nerd myself. So I've worked at these crazy, nerdy, hard to understand companies. My parents have never understood really what my companies did. But ChatGPT came out, article next morning in the New York Times. My mom calls me and she's like, Barry, is this OpenAI ChatGPT? Are they competitive with what you're doing?
Wow, that's amazing.
I know. I was like, that's incredible, Mom. You actually finally understand what my company does pretty closely. And I've told customers, that story 500 times and it resonates super well. But it's, how do you make these technologies human ultimately so you can relate to the people we're talking to? Like even super technical people I talk to, the pace at which innovation is going in our space, they don't live and breathe this all day, right? Like they're an IT person in a big bank trying to focus on, lowering their costs. They're not reading every Gen AI paper being dropped on archive. It's our job to educate them on all on all
Yeah.
of them. Now, of course, I rambled for so long, I forgot what you
No, I think no, I haven't asked my question yet. I just realized. I mean, I think the pace of change and advancement has become so fast. I wonder even if the researchers are able to keep up with it themselves. They probably have some agents and bots taking care of being in the know, right? And
We had so at Mosaic, one of our big claim to fames is, we had one of the best and have still one of the best research teams in the world that are at the forefront of doing all this. But we had an individual, even when we were just a Mosaic, and the team was like 10 to 15 people, 16-ish when we got bought, that would actually, he's so smart, he would go and read all these papers on arXiv himself. And then he has a newsletter where he, at least at the time, maybe he's automated more of it now, would distill down the latest 20 papers, and these are the ones you need to be reading. And here's a synopsis of all of it. You can train LLMs to do it, but like that human touch in some of these things is still hugely important. But yeah, having access, and that's one of our core values too in our GenAI part of Databricks is, we are at the forefront of the technologies that we are productionizing, the latest research that makes sense into, the products to go support the customers and the problems that they're trying to solve for.
yeah. Well, my last true or false statement for you before we let you go. So the statement is going to be, so today, like you mentioned earlier, Databricks customers and in general, the users and customers for data infra, ML AI tools, they tend to be the likes of ML engineers, data scientists, those kinds of people. 5 years from now, the statement is it's going to be software developers. Agree? Disagree?
I'd be even more potentially controversial. I think it's going to be more business users. I think we're democratizing AI at such a fast pace that, look, the number of capabilities you see in the market, and we have 1, 2, and we've helped a bunch of customers build their own. Think about just text to SQL. Right. I now no longer, for the most part, need to rely. I'm a business user, right? I'm a marketer or a salesperson in a big company. I want to know my last number of sales in XYZ region across ABC products over whatever time frame. And you can get to second orders of questioning all those sorts of things. For the most part, you have to go submit a ticket, get a data scientist to go write a SQL script. They go figure out what tables to go pull that from, which takes them longer than writing the SQL script. It gets pretty hard, pretty fast and time consuming. And then you're in a queue and hopefully you get your answer back in 2 to 3 days. And I think now with LLMs are so good at code generation, or getting so good. And we just released, I just saw some stuff that we're doing, our research team's doing internally that, the numbers are surpassing what we expected. These capabilities, like any one of us, if we didn't know SQL, could easily use natural language. And Andre Carpathia, that famous tweet, the new programming language is English. I think that's 100% accurate. Now, anybody in an organization, that question, like, what were the sales across these products in these regions over this time frame, excluding this, and this, it can go generate that complex SQL script, go hit the tables that it knows it needs to go hit, understand what ARR means or whatever, uniqueness within your organization, and then come back with that result set or that answer, right? And I want to go see that as a graph or a chart. I think you're still going to need data engineers. You're going to need data scientists. You're going to need ML engineers. I don't think any of the technology folks are going away. But I think the people driving the conversation are going to be much more on the business side, because they're going to be able to interact with the data a lot more directly than they've ever been able to before.
Yeah, absolutely. Barry, on that note, I think I'm going to tell my kids to consider English as a hot major for colleges. That looks like that may be in the cards 5 years from now. Thank you so much for your time. This was such an enlightening and energizing conversation. Really appreciate your time, Barry.
Thanks,
awesome.
Barry.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciated it.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Enterprise GTM podcast. Subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on your favorite podcast platform so we can continue to help enterprise founders thrive.